Coming up, this week the UK saw yet another wave of polling results coming in, showing the collapse in public support of both Brexit and of the Tories. And I'll be taking a look at some of the new findings in this video. Also, in last week's video I spoke about the much trumpeted post-Brexit free trade deals with Australia and New Zealand that began this month, and how the minister in charge of the UK's negotiating team had this to say now that he's no longer in government.
The first step is to recognise that the Australia trade deal is not actually a very good deal for the UK.
Well, this week, as a special treat, I'll be looking at the coverage that the Brexit trade deal has been getting down under. Stay tuned. I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, subscribe, and above all, share a link to this video with your social media contacts. So let's start by looking at the coverage of the new post-Brexit trade deal from the Australian broadcaster Channel 9 news team, who I think epitomised the amused and incredulous reaction that I often see to Brexit wherever I travel abroad. They seem to find this Brexit fallout incredibly funny, but also they seem to feel a bit sorry for Britain self-harming in this way.
Anyway, we have a new free trade agreement with the UK. Some British products will become cheaper. Exciting news. I just wonder, what does Britain actually have to offer us? I mean, there's beautiful MGs. If you can imagine the top-down Matty riding. Here we are. This is you riding to the Callide power station earlier this morning with the top down. Oh, hang on. The MG's owned by a Chinese company.
Yeah, that's right. That's
so
true.
What else do they have? There's black pudding, Cumberland sausages. That's about it, isn't it?
Carlos, there's a Spice Girls CDs, a nice cup of English breakfast tea. Don't be so hard on the Brits.
All right, name one good export from the UK, Matty.
It's hard, isn't it? I suppose. The peas pies, I don't know. Yeah, it's very hard. But this is about what we sell to them, Carl. It's a good thing for us. Good thing for us because we get to sell more beef, and that's great for everybody in Australia.
Now, just picking up on that reference to selling more beef into Britain, Liz Webster, chair of Save British Farming, pointed out that Britain always had full access to the Australian market, and went on to say that this deal opens up the British market to Australian meat which is reared in monstrous feedlots. Liz Webster then added that it's lack of ability to reject lower standards that's the issue, thereby destroying food security and public health. And for me, with that last point, she's summarising the Brexit that the Tories have foisted upon the UK. It's all about lowering standards, not just in food, but also in the areas of environmental protection, employment protection, health and safety. It's this Tufton Street neoconservative ideal of free markets, unburdened by standards, responsibilities or regulation. It's a pro-corporation Brexit where consumers, employees and the public at large are the ones who suffer with lower food standards, shit in the rivers, air pollution, loss of freedoms of movement, of the right to protest and loss of employment protections. On top of that, we see profit gouging by corporations that are being allowed to become ever more powerful since Brexit. No wonder that new polling shows almost 2/3 of voters now believe that Brexit is behind runaway inflation and soaring food prices. BMG research for the I newspaper also shows that even among Leave voters, over 1/3 of them now realise that Brexit has had a negative impact on the cost of living. Fair play to those Leave voters though, better late than never. And I love this quote from Robert Struthers, head of polling at BMG, who commented on the poll results as follows. Nigel Farage said Brexit has failed, and it appears that the public largely agrees. In not a single policy area do we find more of the public saying our EU exit has had a positive than negative impact. Lovely stuff. And talking of Farage admitting that Brexit has failed, here's a picture of the latest Led by Donkeys poster campaign in case you haven't caught it elsewhere. This poster appeared near Salisbury's main train station this week. Apparently, 150 of these posters have been distributed around towns and cities across Britain. Led by Donkeys themselves have commented on this campaign by saying that it's a colossal admission from the godfather of the Brexit campaign and should be the final verdict on the catastrophic experiment. Just a little bit too late for last week's video, I also wanted to cover former Tory Minister Chris Patton's rant on BBC's Question Time. Patton used to be my MP when I was at the University of Bath, and he was also the governor of Hong Kong, a place where I worked for many years, so I'm very familiar with Chris Patton, and to be fair, he always was one of the more sensible Tories. Here's what he said about Brexit.
And the truth is, we're in one hell of a mess. Yeah. Our GDP per capita now is less than not only France, Germany, the Netherlands, it's lower than Ireland, it's lower, for heaven's sake, than Lithuania. The poorest 20% in Britain are poorer than the poorest 20% in Poland. That is not the sign of a community, of a country which has things going for it. But it's also, and this is a word one isn't supposed to use anymore, it's also because of Brexit. It's because of what Brexit did to the value of the pound. It's because of what Brexit has done to make it more difficult for us to import goods and for us to import labour. And importing food now is costing us, according to the LSE, £7 billion more a year because we're outside the European Union.
Chris Patton clearly shares the frustration of millions of us who just want those in power, both Leavers and Remainers, to fess up to the damage Brexit continues to cause to our economy and to our quality of life. And along with these political leaders who can't confront the truth about Brexit, despite the polling numbers I covered earlier, there are still a significant amount of Leave voters who are not ready yet to accept the truth about Brexit. They're in a state of denial, indulging in a fight-or-flight behaviour pattern. And I see it in day-to-day life and in some of the badly written comments on this channel. You have the flight behaviours, running away from the truth, blaming our woes on the Ukraine war or the pandemic, or in some cases the last Labour government back in 2008-2009. And then you have the other group of Brexitists that want to make the fight about whether indeed Brexit has actually happened. Apparently, it hasn't, you know. In the words of George Orwell in 1984, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. But apparently, Brexit hasn't really happened because Remainers, something something, the EU still something something, World Economic Forum, or variations on those themes that mention the blob, the woke civil service, or the, for now delayed, bonfire of legislation dating from our time as an EU member country. I watched Mark Manson's new documentary on Netflix this week, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And although I found it a bit underwhelming, there were nevertheless some really interesting points that Manson made that I thought could be applied to the remaining Brexitists. How about this, for example? I think we live in a culture today of what I would describe as delusional positivity, to simply believe things you want to believe because they feel good. I'm thinking here of how back in 2016, after 6 years of Cameron-Osborne Tory austerity, along came Farage, Rees-Mogg and Johnson, blaming everything on the EU and promising life would be perfect once we got our sovereignty back, whatever that was supposed to mean. But for some people, the idea of sovereignty and taking back control felt good. Manson continues, I find this attitude to be very dangerous and damaging because the fact of the matter is that life is always going to suck a little bit. Brexit was meant to be the magical solution, freeing ourselves from under the harness of Brussels, restoring Britain's former glory and allowing us to become the world's free trade hub. Back to Manson. So this idea that we're going to somehow find some magical solution to dissolve our suffering, to dissolve our dissatisfaction permanently, it's just bullshit. Brexit was never going to solve the problems that its proponents promised it would. And this delusional positivity has proved every bit as dangerous and damaging as Manson warns. One other Brexit-related thing I took from this documentary was Mark Manson's references to Second Lieutenant Hire Onoda of the Japanese Imperial Army. You probably know him best as the Japanese soldier who refused to accept that Japan had lost the war, or indeed that the Second War was even over, and continued to fight on, alone, in the jungles of Lubang, an island in the Philippines, right up until 1974. He was regularly confronted with evidence of Japan's defeat, including leaflets, family letters, and pictures being scattered across the island, which he retrieved and read. There was even a letter from the Japanese emperor himself imploring Onoda to give himself up. But Onoda refused to believe the information was real. He believed it was all a trick by the Americans. The Brexitists refused to believe that Brexit is real. They think it's all a trick by the establishment and that Brexit hasn't actually happened. Onoda continued to fight, denying reality. At one point, a visit by his own brother was arranged. Onoda watched from a hiding place as his brother called out his childhood nickname and sang their old school song, imploring Onoda to give himself up as the war had ended. We now know that Onoda watched and wondered. Could he have been wrong for the last 15 years? But the true answer to him was too painful for him to consider. Onoda dismissed his brother as a convincing fake sent by the enemy to confuse him. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, it was impossible for him to accept he had been wrong, and he told himself ever more desperate stories to try to explain away this evidence that contradicted his worldview. Can you relate this to the Brexitists who still swear that Brexit hasn't actually happened, or that Brexit is actually a runaway success, or that the EU itself is breaking up, when in every single EU member country, recent polls tell us that support for the EU is at a historical high thanks to our basket case Brexit? When Onoda finally accepted the evidence of his own eyes and ears and surrendered in 1974, he began to weep uncontrollably. You can imagine a similar reaction when the Brexiteers eventually shed the burden of their certainty that Brexit was any kind of solution to their dissatisfactions and problems. When they give up that pretense that they knew exactly what they were voting for, trying to deny objective facts relating to the disastrous consequences that Brexit has had. Every event that occurs, they simply reinterpret it to fit their pre-2016 worldview. Nigel Farage is the personification of this. I'll leave you with this excerpt, illustrating exactly what I've been talking about from his recent Newsnight interview with Victoria Derbyshire.
A poll from last month showed that, this is a general Brexit question, 53% of people say it was wrong to Brexit. That was a poll last month. Around 1 in 5 Leave voters regret it. The OBR forecasts a 4% hit to the economy over the medium to long term.
Don't make me laugh on
Hang
that.
on,
Yeah.
that's 40 billion in tax revenues.
Comical.
The UK economy is the only G7 economy not back to its pre-pandemic size. Business investment has lagged behind comparable economies. Economically, the UK would have been better staying in, wouldn't it?
I don't think that for a moment. But what I do think...
Based on all that?
But what I do think is we haven't actually benefited from Brexit economically when we could have done. I mean, what Brexit's proved, I'm afraid, is that our politicians are about as useless as the commissioners in Brussels were. We've mismanaged this totally. We're regulating our own businesses even more than they were as EU members. Brexit has
come back
failed.
for you then?
Well, I wouldn't rule it out.